By the way, you going to get the votes? He better get them. He better get them. Oh, he better. Otherwise, I'll say, Tom, you're fired. I'll get somebody.
And today, Tom Price, the Health and Human Services Secretary, resigned, becoming the first cabinet secretary to leave the Trump administration. But technically, it wasn't health care that took him down. Price resigned after days of scrutiny for jetting around the country on private planes. According to some estimates, his private jet trips gobbled up more than $1 million of taxpayer money. In his resignation letter, Price said, "I regret that the recent events have created a distraction." The president today accepted Price's resignation, making Don J. Wright, the current deputy assistant HHS secretary, the acting secretary. And tonight, Trump's budget director, Mick Mulvaney, sent a letter to the rest of Trump's cabinet officials, reminding them of something you'd think they'd already know, that they are public servants. Quote, "Every penny we spend comes from the taxpayer. We thus owe it to the taxpayer to work as hard managing that money wisely as the taxpayer must do to earn it in the first place. Put another way, just because something is legal doesn't make it right." That's a lesson several other Trump cabinet secretaries might want to take to heart. Hint, hint, Steve Mnuchin, Scott Pruitt, Ryan Zinke, and Donald Shulkin, all under fire for their swanky taxpayer-funded travel as well. And a new report tonight finds that it's not just the gilded Trump cabinet doing the spending. According to CBS News, the Trump kids' annual Aspen ski vacation in March, that fancy vacay cost taxpayers some $300,000. Joining us now, Jonathan Capehart, an opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor, and Betsy Woodruff, politics reporter for The Daily Beast. So, you know, Jonathan, this is an administration that's come in saying they were going to go after waste, fraud, and abuse. We can't afford food stamps. We can't afford health care. But they certainly do live high on the hog. Did Tom Price pay the price for living too well on the public dime? Or in your view, was it living too high on the public dime plus health care didn't pass?
It's that, but also the other thing you left out, getting bad headlines that reflected poorly on the president. Because we have a president who cares only about what his headlines are. And so a couple of days ago, Joy, I tweeted out, let's be clear here. President Trump is not upset by what Secretary Price did. He's upset by the negative press caused by what Secretary Price did. And so with all the people that you mentioned who also have their sort of flight gate problems, you know, flying around on private planes at the expense of taxpayers, only Secretary Price is the one who has had to walk the plank. And it didn't help that health care, Trump care, went down in a ball of flames again. But I don't think we're going to see any of those other people you mentioned walking the plank in the way that former Secretary Price did.
Well, we'll see what happens if tax reform doesn't go through. Then Steve Mnuchin, you know, his travel might look like a lot more interesting to Donald Trump. Betsy, you know, Price did try to reverse those headlines Jonathan talked about. He tried to sort of clean them up. He offered to pay back $51,887, but not the full cost of the planes, just the cost of his seat. Is there any evidence that that effort to try to clean it up might have actually made things worse in the eyes of Donald Trump or made him look weak?
I haven't seen any evidence suggesting that that's part of the reason. And my sense here very much is that the planes were basically just an excuse for the president to fire Secretary Price. My understanding is that there was little love lost between Price and President Trump. These are two very different men. Price is Southern. He's very conservative. He's very much in the Paul Ryan mold when it comes to how public figures present themselves, how they perform their work. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, of course, dispositionally is extremely at odds at that. My sense is that their relationship was never a particularly warm one. And then when you couple that with the fact that Price became the face of this huge failure to repeal the Affordable Care Act, it actually, this plane crisis was sort of my sense, the sense that I get just from having conversations with folks this evening, is that the plane crisis was a convenient reason for the president to shuttle off Price. But remember, the president has an extraordinarily high comfort level with Conway. controversies. This is a guy who was willing to give the benefit of the doubt to white supremacists in Charlottesville. The idea that all of a sudden he's worried about the bad PR from people flying on fancy planes doesn't really pass the lab test.
Yeah, and he hired a lot of billionaires for somebody who's concerned about optics, Jonathan. And not only Price is not the only one, to Betsy's point. You had Kellyanne Conway, who was also on that Price private plane trip from Dulles to Philly and back on September 15th. That cost about $25,000. She did that as well. You had Steve Mnuchin, who's had his own issues with spending. You've had Ryan Zinke, who back in July, who's made trips that were expensive. You had Mike Pence, who it was reported his Super Bowl trip cost taxpayers about $89 grand. So it's not as if Price is the only one, nor is he the only sort of big spending billionaire. So it had to be something more, right?
Right. It had to be something more. And the disaster that was Trump Care, I agree with Betsy, was probably part of it. But here's the thing, just broadly speaking, Joy, that makes this whole thing so galling. Donald Trump ran for president saying we're going to drain the swamp. Secretary Price was one of these people who is on record bemoaning sort of the profligate ways of Washington. And even I think there's him going on about private planes that the government has. And yet he is drummed out over his use of private planes and like flagrantly using private planes. I mean, Joy, would you take a plane from Philadelphia to New York? Or I would never take a plane from Philadelphia to Washington. And so to my mind, that shows just this unbelievable disconnect between, you know, the words that they say when they're in Congress, and then suddenly they are wrapped in the trappings of power, and suddenly they see these planes and all these things, and they take advantage of them. They have lost their way when their message that got them into office is completely ignored, and they forget that this money that they're spending isn't theirs, it's the taxpayers. And I think this is ultimately going to be yet another problem for the president, because people are going to start maybe one day paying attention to the fact that the words from the campaign and the words from the administration don't match the actions of either.
Yeah, and, you know, Betsy, you know, I was talking earlier on Chris Hayes' show about the idea that, you know, Trump is almost Teflon to his base. There's nothing he can do that would upset them. They see his gold palace as sort of aspirational. They're fine with it. But at a certain point, when you have so many cabinet members, and when it's Pruitt at EPA, it's Zinke at Interior, it's Shulkin at VA, it's the Treasury Secretary, it's the Vice President, that are all living high on the hog on the taxpayer dime. At a certain point, does the Trump voter begin to say, wait a minute, they're laughing at me. They're using this money, they're using these jobs as a way to pad their lifestyles, and they're literally just sort of laughing in the face of those of us who wanted to drain the swamp?
My sense is that Trump voters will only say that if Trump himself says that. And part of American culture is almost this glorification, idolization of extraordinary levels of wealth. That explains so much of the entertainment we consume, the reality TV shows that we choose to watch. The word you use here is really helpful, aspiration, right? So the fact that Mnuchin's wife was posting Instagram pictures of herself and tagging the designers that she was wearing isn't something I think that necessarily would trouble the Trump base. And I think if it were going to, we'd see Trump behave differently. But the reality is that Melania Trump, the First Lady, Ivanka, Trump's inner circle, these folks, none of these people are trying to hide or disguise the fact that they're extraordinarily wealthy. And as long as the president's comfortable with it, I think his voters are going to be comfortable with it. Thus far, I've not seen any indications that the president's opulent lifestyle is going to be a liability for him. When it comes to his cabinet members, the only question is, does he decide to say it's a problem, as he did in the case of Secretary Price, or does he stick up to them and try to change the conversation?
Well, I'm old enough to remember when Tea Party people and Republicans used to claim that government workers were all overpaid and we needed a hiring freeze, and they didn't deserve the money they were making. We had to bust their unions and pay them less. I remember that one long ago. You know, I'm sorry, we're out of time. But quickly, Jonathan, go on, say it.
No, really quickly, no one begrudges someone being wealthy and serving in the government. That's not the issue here. And I just want to give one shout out to Secretary Betsy DeVos, who is wildly wealthy, flies on a private plane, but it's her private plane.
Yeah. There we go. And a shout out. Betsy Woodruff, thank you for joining us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.